The heat was a physical weight that afternoon, a thick, suffocating blanket that turned the air into liquid lead. Young Elias stood in the middle of a 40-acre patch of dust, his boots disappearing into the powdery remains of what used to be topsoil. He wasn't looking at the sky for rain like every other man in the valley. He was looking at the seed bag in his calloused hands. It was August, the month when the earth usually goes to sleep under the sun's lash. Yet here he was, tearing open sacks of winter rye. The old-timers down at the general store leaned against their rusting trucks, spitting tobacco and trading insults. They called him a fool, a boy playing at a man's game with a mind gone soft from the heat. Before we see how this dusty seed changed everything, subscribe to Beyond the Fields and join our community of those who honor the land. The laughter echoed across the dry creek bed, but Elias just kept walking. The valley hadn't always been a graveyard of dreams. There were stories, whispered by grandfathers in the dim light of kerosene lamps, of a time when the black dirt was so rich you could almost smell the life humming beneath the surface. Back then, the rains came like clockwork, gentle gray curtains that swept across the hills every Tuesday evening, leaving the corn tall and the cattle fat. But those days were buried under 40 years of hard use and short-sightedness. The soil had been bled white. Generation after generation had taken from the land without ever thinking to give back, pushing the acreage for one more harvest of soy, one more push of corn, until the very spirit of the earth seemed to break. You could see it in the way the horizon looked, a shimmering, hazy line where the green had been replaced by a sickly, pale yellow. The farmers here were tired. Their bones ached with the kind of fatigue that sleep can't touch, a weariness born from watching the bank balance dwindle while the cost of fertilizer climbed higher than the silos. They worked the same way their fathers did, because changing meant admitting that the old ways were failing. They clung to their iron plows and their chemical jugs like drowning men clutching at anchors. The dust was everywhere. It coated the dashboards of their trucks, it settled in the deep creases of their foreheads, and it filled the lungs of their children. When a wind kicked up from the south, it didn't smell like clover or wet grass. It smelled like burnt rock and ancient, dried-out misery. The creek, once a place where boys caught crawfish and cooled their heels, was nothing more than a jagged scar of cracked mud and sun-bleached stones. Every year, the yields got smaller. The stalks grew thinner, their leaves curling inward like burnt paper long before the autumn frost could touch them. People started leaving. Boarded-up windows became the most common sight on the back roads, staring out like the hollow eyes of ghosts. Those who stayed did so out of a stubborn, bitter pride. They viewed the land not as a partner, but as an adversary that had to be beaten into submission. They fought the weeds with poison, and they fought the dryness with deeper wells, never realizing they were just digging their own graves. Elias's father had been one of them, a man who worked himself into an early grave trying to squeeze blood from a stone. When he died, he left Elias nothing but 40 acres of exhausted dirt and a stack of unpaid bills. The neighbors expected the boy to sell out and head for the city, to find a job in a factory where the air was thick with grease instead of dust. But Elias stayed. He spent his nights reading by a single bulb, studying the old texts and the new science, looking at the way the wild grass grew on the edges of the road where the plows never touched. He saw how the weeds stayed green while the crops withered. He began to understand that the land wasn't dead, it was just starving. It was out of balance, its heart stripped away by decades of greed. While the other men spent their evenings at the diner complaining about the government and the weather, Elias was out in his fields, digging small holes with his bare hands, feeling the temperature of the dirt, tasting the grit on his tongue. He knew the valley was forgetting its own history. It was forgetting that the earth is a living thing that needs to breathe and rest. The struggle wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. The decay was slow, a creeping rot that claimed a barn roof one year and a fence line the next. You could hear it in the silence of the valley, a heavy, expectant silence that felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the final collapse. The farmers didn't see the boy as a hope. They saw him as a mirror reflecting their own failures. If he tried something different and it worked, it meant they had been wrong for 40 years. And in a place where pride is the only thing left in the pantry, being wrong is a sin nobody is willing to forgive. So they watched him with narrowed eyes, waiting for the moment he would finally break, waiting for the dust to claim him just like it had claimed everything else in this valley that time forgot. The arrival of the black SUV was the first sign that the vultures had finally caught the scent of death. It wasn't a local vehicle. It was too clean, too shiny, the kind of machine that looked like it belonged on a showroom floor in the city, rather than bouncing over the washboard ruts of a country road. Inside was a man named Marcus Thorne. He wore a suit that cost more than a decent tractor and had a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a professional, practiced expression of concern that masked a cold, calculating hunger. Thorne represented a multi-state development firm that specialized in distressed assets. To the men in the valley, their farms were their lives, their legacies, the very marrow of their bones. To Thorne, the valley was just a series of coordinates on a map, a collection of tired soil and desperate people that could be bought for pennies on the dollar and turned into something profitable. Industrial warehouses, a luxury golf course, or perhaps just a massive tax write-off. He started at the edge of the valley, moving from porch to porch with a briefcase full of legal documents and a tongue tipped with honey. He didn't come with threats. He came with solutions. He spoke of the burden of debt, the impossibility of the current climate, and the dignity of a clean exit. One by one, the foreclosure signs started sprouting like weeds. They were bright, aggressive splashes of red and white that stood out against the dull brown of the dying fields. Thorne would stand by his car, looking out over the landscape not with the eye of a steward, but with the eye of a butcher looking at a carcass. He saw the struggling farmers as obstacles in the way of progress. When he reached Elias's gate, he didn't even bother to get out at first. He just sat there, the engine idling with a low, expensive hum, watching the boy work. Elias was out there in the heat, hand broadcasting seed from a shoulder bag, his movements rhythmic and steady despite the blistering sun. Thorne finally stepped out, his polished shoes clicking on the hard-packed earth. He didn't offer a handshake. He just leaned against the fence and gestured toward the parched ground. He told Elias that he was wasting his youth on a lost cause. He talked about the futility of planting in August, about how the soil was spent, a word he used with a certain clinical coldness. He offered a price that was insulting, yet higher than anything the boy could hope to make from a harvest that year. Elias didn't stop his pace. He didn't even look up until he reached the end of the row. When he finally spoke, his voice was like the rasp of sandpaper on wood. He told Thorne the land wasn't for sale. Not today, not next year, not ever. Thorne laughed then, a short, sharp sound that carried on the wind. He told the boy that the bank would do the work for him soon enough. He pointed to the surrounding properties, explaining how he already owned the water rights to the north and the grazing land to the west. He was building a wall of paperwork around the boy's 40 acres, squeezing him from all sides. The corporate strategy was simple: isolate the holdouts, starve them of resources, and wait for the inevitable collapse. Thorne viewed the farmers' attachment to the land as a sentimental weakness, a flaw in their character that he could exploit. He didn't understand the grit of the soil or the soul of the people who worked it. To him, the world was built on contracts and leverage, not on the sweat of a man's brow or the integrity of a seed. He left Elias with a business card that the boy didn't even pick up from the dirt. As the SUV sped away, kicking up a massive cloud of suffocating dust, the foreclosure signs seemed to glow with a predatory light. The community was fracturing. Some neighbors, broken by debt and lured by Thorne's promises of a fresh start, began to look at Elias with resentment. They wanted him to sell, so they wouldn't feel like the only ones who had given up. The pressure was mounting, a silent, invisible weight that pressed down on the boy's shoulders every time he walked to the mailbox. The corporate machine was moving, slow and unstoppable, grinding the history of the valley into dust, preparing to pave over the memories of 100 years with the cold, gray asphalt of corporate greed. The mocking began in earnest, at Miller's Feed and Seed. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where the humidity makes the air feel like wet wool. Elias had walked in to buy more rye, his clothes stained with salt, and his skin burned a deep, leathery red. The store was crowded with men who had nothing better to do than wait for a rain that wasn't coming. Old Man Miller himself paused with a scoop of grain in midair, looking at Elias over his spectacles. He asked the boy if he was planning on harvesting dust bunnies or if he'd simply forgotten what month it was. The room erupted in a chorus of dry, hacking chuckles. They called him August Rye, a nickname that tasted like a joke in their mouths. They asked him if he was expecting a miracle, or if he'd found a way to make the sun shine cold. One farmer, a man named Henderson, who had already signed his papers over to Thorne, stepped forward and poked a finger into Elias's chest. He told him he was making the rest of them look bad, holding out for a dream that had died before he was born. He told him the rye would never take, that the birds would eat the seed and the sun would bake the rest. Elias didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just paid his bill and carried the heavy sacks out to his rusted-out truck. But the ridicule didn't stop at the store. It followed him home. It was in the way people turned their heads when he drove past. It was in the late-night phone calls from anonymous friends telling him to give up before the bank took his boots too. The physical toll was even worse. Planting in the heat of August is a special kind of hell. The ground was so hard it felt like concrete, vibrating through his bones with every step of the tractor. When the old machine finally gave out, he did the work by hand, his back screaming in protest, his fingers cracking and bleeding from the dry air. He was a ghost on his own land, moving through the shimmering heat waves, while Thorne's surveyors marched along his property lines with their high-tech lasers and their smug expressions. They would stand on the road and point at his field, laughing at the patches of green that were starting to poke through the gray crust. To them, it looked like a desperate, pathetic attempt to grow a crop that had no market value. Rye wasn't a cash crop. It wouldn't pay the mortgage. It wouldn't stop the foreclosure. Every day the sun rose like a burning eye, searching for any sign of moisture to evaporate. Elias spent his nights hauling buckets of water from the dying creek just to keep the youngest shoots alive, his muscles twitching with exhaustion. He lost weight until his cheekbones stood out like knives. He looked like a man possessed, a man who had lost his grip on reality. The weight of the mocking laugh is heavier than any stone. It wears you down from the inside, making you question your own eyes and your own heart. There were moments, in the dark hours before dawn, when he sat on his porch and looked at the glowing lights of the city on the horizon, wondering if Thorn was right. Maybe the land was done. Maybe he was just a fool chasing a ghost. But then he would think of his father's hands and the way the earth used to feel when it was healthy. He would think of the corporate suit and the foreclosure signs, and a cold, hard anger would settle in his gut. It wasn't just about the rye anymore. It was about the insult of being told that his labor had no value. It was about the arrogance of those who thought they could buy a man's soul because his pockets were empty. He endured the laughter because he knew something they didn't, or perhaps something they had simply forgotten. He knew that the greatest strengths are often hidden beneath the surface, and that the loudest voices are rarely the ones that carry the truth. He kept planting, row after row, seed after seed, while the valley watched and waited for him to fall. As the weeks turned into months, the secret of the rye began to manifest in a way that defied the logic of the valley. While the neighbors' fallow fields turned into a lunar landscape of shifting sand and deep, jagged cracks, Elias's 40 acres began to take on a strange, defiant hue. It wasn't the vibrant, artificial green of a fertilized lawn. It was a deep, bluish emerald, a color that looked out of place against the scorched backdrop of the August heat. The secret wasn't in the grain itself, but in what was happening beneath the surface. Winter rye is a miracle of the natural world, a plant built for struggle. While the traditional crops the others grew had shallow, lazy roots that gave up at the first sign of trouble, the rye sent down long, searching tendrils that could reach 3, 4, even 5 feet into the earth. Elias hadn't planted it to sell. He had planted it to save. The rye acted as a living skin for the earth. Its dense canopy of leaves shaded the soil, dropping the ground temperature by 10 degrees and preventing the sun from baking the life out of the microbial world below. As the plants grew, they acted like a massive biological pump. They pulled nitrogen from the air and tucked it deep into the soil, fixing the very balance that decades of industrial farming had destroyed. The roots worked like a subterranean drill, breaking up the hard-packed clay and creating tiny channels for air and water to penetrate. Every time a rare, fleeting rain cloud passed over and dropped a few measly drops, the other farmers watched as the water simply hit the hard crust and ran off into the dry ditches, carrying the last of their topsoil with it. But on Elias's land, the water stayed. The rye caught the moisture in its leaves and funneled it down into those deep root channels, soaking it up like a sponge. The soil began to change. It turned from a pale, dead gray to a rich, moist brown. Underneath the cover of the rye, the worms returned. Life, in its smallest and most vital form, began to pulse again in the dark. Elias spent his days tending to the crop, not with chemicals, but with patience. He was building a reservoir of life. He knew that the rye would eventually die back, and when it did, he would plow it directly into the ground, turning the plant matter into organic gold. It was a winter breath, because it brought the coolness and the moisture of the deep earth up to the surface, even when the August sun was trying its best to kill everything in sight. The neighbors saw the green, but they didn't understand the science. They thought he was lucky, or that he had a hidden well. They didn't see the thousands of hours he'd spent studying the rhythm of the seasons. They didn't see the way he was carefully managing the nitrogen cycles, ensuring that when the time came for a real crop, his land would be the only one with the strength to carry it. Thorne and his developers noticed the green patch too. It bothered them. It was a visual defiance of their narrative that the land was distressed. Thorne sent inspectors to check for illegal water usage, convinced the boy was stealing from the municipal lines. They found nothing. They found only a crop that shouldn't be there, thriving in conditions that should have been lethal. The rye was a fortress. It was protecting the legacy of the farm, holding the ground together while the rest of the valley literally blew away in the wind. Elias watched the weather patterns, noting the way the jet stream was shifting, the way the birds were moving south earlier than usual. He knew a reckoning was coming. The earth was tired of being abused, and it was preparing to reassert its dominance. The rye was his shield, a biological gamble that was finally starting to pay off. The mocking at the feed store grew quieter, replaced by a suspicious, uneasy silence. The farmers would drive by slowly, looking at the lush, swaying stalks of rye, then looking at their own desolate fields. They were seeing the beginning of a resurrection, but their pride wouldn't let them admit it. They were still waiting for the boy to fail, not realizing that the boy had already won the most important battle, the battle for the health of the soil itself. The 3-year mark hit with a brutality that no one in the valley was prepared for. It started with a spring that never came, skipped directly from a freezing winter into a blistering dry heat that stayed for 6 months. The great drought of the valley wasn't just a weather event, it was an execution. One by one, the deep wells that the industrial farmers had relied on began to cough up sand and then go silent. The water table, overtaxed by years of waste, had finally dropped beyond the reach of even the most expensive pumps. This was the moment Marcus Thorne had been waiting for. He moved in like a shark in bloody water, offering even lower prices to the families who could no longer wash their clothes or water their livestock. But Thorne had a problem of his own. His industrial-scale projects, the massive monoculture plots he'd started on the foreclosed lands, were failing spectacularly. He'd used the same aggressive, chemical-heavy methods as the old farmers, but on a much larger scale. Without water to flush the salts from the soil, his crops shriveled and died within weeks. The ground he'd bought was turning into a dust bowl, the topsoil blowing away in great, choking clouds that threatened to bury the very roads he'd planned to pave. It was in this moment of total collapse that Elias's 40 acres became a beacon. While the rest of the valley was a sea of brown and gray, his fields were a riot of life. He wasn't just growing rye anymore. He had rotated into a hearty, heirloom wheat that thrived in the rich, nitrogen-dense soil he'd built over the last 3 years. But more importantly, his land was the only place that still had water. Because his soil was rich in organic matter, it acted as a massive subterranean reservoir. It held the moisture from the previous winter like a vault, while the neighbors' wells ran dry because the water had nowhere to go but down or away. The moisture on Elias's farm was held in the roots and the humus. Then came the day the town council and the remaining farmers gathered at the edge of his property. They were desperate. Their cattle were dying, and the local reservoir was a puddle of mud. Thorne was there too, looking uncharacteristically haggard, his suit dusty and his confidence shaken. He tried one last time to buy the farm, not for development this time, but for the water. He offered a sum that would have made Elias a wealthy man for life. Elias looked at the men he'd grown up with, the ones who had laughed at him, the ones who had called him a fool, and the ones who had sold out to the man in the suit. He didn't see enemies. He saw a community that had lost its way. He didn't take Thorne's money. Instead, he opened his gates. He showed the farmers how he'd done it. He pointed to the remains of the rye that were still visible in the mulch between his rows. He explained that the water wasn't in a pipe, it was in the dirt itself. He allowed the neighbors to bring their remaining livestock to his ponds, which were still holding steady because the surrounding ryegrass had prevented evaporation and runoff. He became the valley's only salvation, not through charity, but through the sheer resilience of the land he'd healed. The corporate developers couldn't compete with a healthy ecosystem. Thorne's investors, seeing the ecological disaster his methods had caused compared to the oasis Elias had created, pulled their funding. The lawsuits began to pile up against Thorne for land mismanagement and water rights violations. The distressed assets were suddenly worth nothing to a man who only understood profit, but they were worth everything to the boy who understood the earth. The day the wells ran dry was the day the power shifted. The laughter had stopped 3 years ago, but it was only now that the true harvest began. A harvest of respect, of community, and of a future that didn't belong to a corporation, but to the people who were willing to get their hands dirty to save it. The rye is long gone now, turned back into the earth to feed the next generation of life. The valley is slowly turning green again, but this time it's a different kind of green. The neighbors who stayed are following Elias's lead, planting cover crops and learning the language of the soil instead of the language of the bank. Marcus Thorne and his black SUV are a bitter memory, a ghost of a greed that almost swallowed us whole. Looking out over these 40 acres, I see more than just a successful farm. I see the quiet resilience of a man who knew that the earth doesn't care about quarterly reports or mocking laughter. It only cares about how you treat it. The boy who was called a fool is now the steward of our future, a living reminder that the greatest treasures aren't found in a briefcase, but in a handful of dusty seeds and the patience to wait for them to grow. In the end, the land always has the last word. It rewards the humble and breaks the proud. As long as there are those like Elias who work the soil with respect, the soul of this land will never truly die.